Good evening, good evening, good evening, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Weather Brains episode number 929. This show turns 18 years old in January. Wow. We started our first show in January of 2006, before most people knew what a podcast was. But here we are, almost 18 years later, 929 episodes in. Wow. Well, anyway, if you're new here, the pre-show, this is what we're doing now, the pre-show. This is the magical, marvelous, amazing time when we basically do three things. We share boring personal stories, humorous anecdotes, and from time to time, we say really, really outrageous things. And this part is not on the audio podcast that goes out to the world. So this is for, the 6th of November, 2023. 'Tis the season. All I see now are Christmas commercials. It's just like Halloween is over and boom, Christmas commercials. I actually saw some before Christmas, and I will be the first to admit I'm the kind of guy that listens to Christmas music in March, May, June, August, September. It's always Christmas around here. It just makes me happy. In fact, my little Christmas tree on my desk stays up year round. A little Charlie Brown Christmas tree. In fact, on my mic boom in the home office, I have a Christmas Santa hat that's always there. So it's just, but we're morphing into the time where everybody starts to celebrate. All the radio stations flip to Christmas music, the ones that do that about a week ago. So, and that means we'll be doing our year ender before you know it with Greg Carbon, our friend from WPC. We always like to go back and look at the year and see what happened. But I just this one is really, really, really flown by. Just as you get older, and people say that as you get older, time accelerates, and it's really true. And there's no way to stop it. It is what it is. So we just let time fly. Time marches on, Bill. Time marches on.
That's right. There's nothing we can do about it. And we're just lucky we have it, I guess, because if we didn't have that perception, I hear it's pretty crazy.
No, and that's the thing. Everybody says Monday sucks. I hate Monday. I can't stand. What do you mean? Mondays are the greatest. I love Mondays. I mean, you should enjoy the fact that you have a Monday. And for me, right. I've had more than, 3 hours of sleep a night for a couple of nights, and I'm refreshed. I'm energized. I mean, I love Mondays.
You get to do WeatherBrains on Mondays.
It's WeatherBrains. I mean, come on. It's the weekly weather party here. So why, it's just, I don't understand it. All I hear is people griping all the time about everything. But Monday, hey, man, it's Monday. I can't believe it. I can't stand it.
Well,
so anyway.
They don't love their jobs like we do, James.
No, goodness. I mean, they're paying us to do what we love to do. I mean, goodness,
they're paying
no
us?
better than this. And
I didn't know we were getting paid.
we're getting paid in the delight of our listeners.
That's right. And then getting to talk to people like Brian Norcross every week.
Brian is going to hang up on us. I didn't even realize he was in I'm sorry, Brian. I'm sorry.
That's all right. I'm enjoying the inspiration there.
It's just like, and listen, this was we're all seasoned veterans here.
Yeah.
The fact that we woke up.
An understatement there, James.
Yeah, yes, that is. But we're breathing and we feel good.
Resemble that remark.
We know what country we're in and what day it is, and so hey, life's good. I mean, I've actually got a little orthopedic issue. I don't get these that often. Got a little tendonitis going here in this right arm, which is odd. So they're going to go down.
You're still playing tennis regularly? Is it tennis?
Yes, it's tennis elbow. We play really hard on Sunday nights, and
you need to go to pickleball, James.
No, come on, man. I'm a tennis guy. Although I do want to try it. I mean, just to say that I did it, but what they do now, that they stick these needles in your arm, and they run electrical current through there. And you can literally feel the pulsing of the current going through your arm and your tendons and muscles. And it's called dry needling. And it really does work. And I think I'm going to get them to stick those needles in my arm. The physical therapy people do it, and they're very good at what they do.
That's something they do to steaks, James.
There you go. But no, but listen, if that's the only problem I have, it's tendonitis. I have no problems at all. So Brian, how you feeling? You look good.
Yeah, I'm, hanging on, getting along, getting up there. But yeah, hurricane season is over, so I'm feeling great, or it's essentially over. Because I post every day that there's something going on. And so it was 3 months every day. I think this is the first year that from the beginning of August to the beginning of November, that it was every day, 7 days a week.
Wow. Hey, this is what we do.
It's what it does though, because I do it first thing in the morning when I get up. I get up and I go to the computer, actually make myself a little breakfast, put it down at the computer, sit there at the computer and write a post. But it really, it gets the day going. And now today was the very first day that I didn't have to do that. And I really kind of got caught up on email, but I'm so used now to getting up and thinking right away. I don't have an on-ramp to.
So what are you going to do in winter?
It's nonstop. Well, when the spring comes, there's conferences and whatnot.
Right.
And this year there's going to be a lot to talk about because so many things went wrong this year. This year brought up a lot of inadequacies or gaps in the system that we haven't seen in recent years. So, that'll be interesting. It'll be a different kind of conference. Usually everybody talks about how good they did. This year they're going to talk about how bad they did and try and figure out why and how we can do better.
Yeah, but we'll save the good stuff for the show here in a couple of minutes. We'll hit the TV in less than 2 minutes, and we'll start the audio recorders. I'm trying to figure out what James ate a lot is doing here. He's been connecting to audio for the last 10 minutes.
Rick is having trouble too.
Really?
So maybe it's the big internet pipeline coming out of Oklahoma.
They need to upgrade that 9600 baud modem to a 1200 baud modem.
Wouldn't that be a downgrade, James?
Yeah, that would be a downgrade. What was the one after 9600? It was 14. What was it?
1440. 14400.
14400.
Yeah.
That's right.
That's the next step up. And then we went to X2.
And then we got 286 chips.
Exactly.
I got DSL, man. I thought nothing will ever beat this. I got 1.5 meg down, 1.5 meg all the time. No dial-up.
I had a dedicated line put in for radio, I think.
Yeah, ISDN. They call that
right?
ISDN.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, they had one of those in my house for radio. But the DSL was just too good. Now up was not good because it's asymmetrical.
Right.
You get 1.5 down, you get like 0.25 up or something. But still, the fact that you didn't have to tie up all the phones in your house and it was good. I want to say it was in the late 90s when I got the DSL in 98, 99. But how far we have come.
Gigabit.
Yeah, I've got the fiber at the house. The bandwidth at my house is better than the bandwidth here in this building. And it gets fine. Yeah, it's fine here, but at my house, it really is gigabit. I mean, it's most of the speed test stuff. It's 990 up, 990 down. And welcome to our television viewers. For those watching, this is WeatherBrains, the weekly party here, and we're about to get started. Jen, you okay?
I'm doing great. I'm a little sleepy, so hopefully I don't nod off. I'll try not to.
If you need to take a nap, you go right ahead. I mean,
okay.
So let's get these things. Let's get the recorders going. And again, we're gonna have to play a little audio before the show starts. So let's see. Be sure y'all can hear the foghorn.
Mm-hmm.
All right, good. Here we go in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Join the American Meteorological Society by becoming a member of the band. The AMS Weather Band is a global community of weather enthusiasts dedicated to learning and sharing their love of science. Visit amsweatherband.org to learn more and join the band today.
WeatherBrains episode 929. This is for the 6th of November, 2023. And you know what's really fascinating to me? This show turns 18 years old. 18 years old.
I missed 17, James. Where did 17 go? We went from 16 to 18. I guess
we started in January of 06. So this is 23. So this is 17.
That was before the iPhone.
That's right. That's right. The iPhone came out in 2007. We started podcasting in 06. And soon we're going to be at 1,000 episodes, and it's been a quite a ride. See Troy Kimmel. Troy seems to be in a chipper, dapper mood today. Troy, how you doing?
I'm doing good. Good to see Brian. It's been a while since I've seen Brian. Good to see you and everyone, of course. And I don't know why I'm in a good mood. It's just not that time of the semester. Usually, this getting closer to finals time and into the semester, things get rather hectic, but in a good mood. So, what the heck?
What the heck? All right. So let's go to James Adelot. Let's see. James, Are you at Wake or at home this week?
I'm at work. The World Series is over, so everything's a tight schedule, and we're squeezing in as much local news as we can possibly shoehorn into a 24-hour day. But goodness, what a pretty day it was in Oklahoma. It was 81 in Tulsa. The average is 66. We'll take it.
And for those that are listening and you can't see, James is in a tank top and flip flops because it was so warm today, and that's a good look. So describe the evening news block. When does it start and when does it end? Just out of curiosity.
We start at 5, the first segment, and it's finished at 7 o'clock, 6:58 and 30 seconds, and the second block starts at 9. And it never ends. Actually, about 10:30 is when we. It just feels like it never ends.
Yeah.
So 10:30 is it for us.
Yeah, in the evening news block is long, but I will say, we've all had to work that morning shift from time to time, and that's the one that never stops. It just never. I mean, you come in at like 3 a.m. and you can't breathe until noon. I mean, it is just brutal.
Yeah,
all the people that work them.
Yeah, big props to them. I did the morning show yesterday, which Sunday is a little bit of a light morning show for us, but on a regular weekday, we're 4 a.m. to 9 a.m.
Wow. Goodness gracious. And like you can't even think about the minute you think you can breathe. 30 seconds, stand by. And it's like they constantly come to you. And I admire anybody that works that TV morning shift and anybody that works the radio shift because, Jen, your job never stops.
No, it did stop Thursday through today, though. I had a little break, and I mentioned I'm a little sleepy, but it's for a good reason. Drove back this morning, my last leg from the Richmond, Virginia trip. Rick and I both spoke. He did virtually, but I was there at the Mid-Atlantic Severe Weather Conference. It was really awesome. If you've never been to that conference, it's really good, and they continue to grow. And Rick and I received a lot of great reception on what we did and presenting on more in El Reno 10 years later. And Rick took the meteorology and the National Weather Service, and I told the people stories. And Rick, I just enjoyed that with you, and I think it went really well.
Yeah, I loved it. The only thing that would have made it better is if I could have been there, but I think it seemed to go really well. Got lots of nice comments, and you made every single person in the room cry, according to what I've heard. So, and in this room too. So,
no, yeah, it was pretty emotional, but it was really it was the biggest thing I've done for Tornado Talk to bring what we're doing to a bigger weather enterprise audience. And so I was really nervous, but I got through it, and it was really great. Aubrey was there, so I got to hang out with her. And it was an awesome time, but just a little sleepy on the back end of it. I'm back on the air tomorrow, and I'll catch up on what's going on across the country.
Yeah, I've learned that the people stories will certainly bring more emotion than the skew T-plots when you're doing an event. And I kind of did that. I 1 year in Starkville, I was doing the skew T's, and the 500 millibar charts and all this stuff. And I just stopped. I just stopped right in the middle of it. And I said, this stuff is great, but we have to remember that it's people that this is all about. And I brought out Matthew Seals, who was he lost his 8-year-old child in the F5 that came through the western part of Birmingham in April of 1998. And he's permanently paralyzed. He came out in his wheelchair, and I just stopped, and he came out. And I mean, you could hear a pin drop. James Spann's a bag of hot air, but boy, when he spoke, the people's stories are just incredible. So we'll hear more about that conference here shortly. But let's see. I think that's everybody. I know that Neil is out tonight. And what's he doing,
is he
Bill
out the
Murray?
booby trap again?
Pub crawl. And Kim had some type of, maybe Neil and Kim are both on the pub crawl. I don't know, but they're both
yeah,
out tonight.
That's right. They're at the Association of the Emergency Managers or something like that. But
yeah,
I think Neil just made all the ham radio operators mad, and he's afraid to come back on.
We'll tell that story in a minute. But Bill Murray, let's bring in our guest. We have a legend on the
yes,
show.
we do. We
have
absolutely have a legend tonight. And James, I may need to drop off at 8:30 because we've got this weather podcast telethon coming up on the 18th, and got tremendous guests for that all over that day. So we'll talk more about that later. But I've got a conference call for that at 8:30. But tonight's guest weather brain needs no introduction. And I say that because I really didn't prepare one, but I've got his bio pulled up, and I thought we would just kind of walk through it a little bit, Brian, because you grew up in Central Florida, right?
Right. I grew up in the Space Coast. Actually, my father was a NASA engineer, and we actually moved there after President Kennedy said we're going to the moon and calling all engineers. So we moved down there. My father worked on Apollo, and I lived it. I walked to the end of my block and watched Apollo 11 go to the moon. And I actually wrote the articles for the Washington Post on the 50th anniversary.
That must have been crazy. I loved one of the PBS specials about, when the anniversary came up. Just that must have been an incredible time to be alive there on the Florida Space Coast.
It was in many, many ways. I mean, it was this confluence of events. I went to Melbourne High School, which was kind of a rundown, nothing special physical place, but somehow there was a confluence of things. This principal came in, a guy named B. Frank Brown, who was this brilliant educator, and he put in a system called the non-graded high school. It said on the portal where you entered the school, imagination is as important as knowledge. And they taught advanced physics. I learned, I went to Florida State, and I was a physics minor, but I took the physics classes with exactly the same book I had as a senior in high school. And it took me a year and a half as a math major in calculus to do the calculus I had in high school. So it was an incredible time where half of my class, which was about 800 or 900 kids, I guess, were the children of NASA engineers. So in my senior class was the winner of the National Science Fair in biology and the runner-up in physics. I mean, it was this amazing, grouping of people and place to be.
Yeah, that's pretty incredible. Talk about that, about Hurricane Camille and the really cool thing that you got to do during that tremendous storm.
Well, I was working on the radio. When I was a teenager, the two things that I was really interested in were science and broadcasting. And I worked to get myself on a radio station when I was in high school. And finally, a new radio station came on the air in Melbourne, and I got them to hire me. And all they did was pay for my gas and gave me some kind of chits to go to some restaurant or something. I remember taking a couple of dates to a restaurant on their dime. But I was there the weekend in August of 1969 that Woodstock was happening. The Apollo 11 astronauts were in a parade in Houston, and Camille was heading for the Florida Panhandle. And we were interested in it because it was heading for Florida at that time, and hurricane warnings were up for the Florida Panhandle on that Saturday, not for Mississippi. And so I was broadcasting. Our rule was that we would just read the advisories, which at that time were issued by the Weather Bureau out of New Orleans for Hurricane Camille. So on YouTube, you'll find me reading on WTAI. WTAI stands for Where the Action Is. 1560 a.m. in Melbourne, the Hurricane Camille advisory on that Saturday afternoon, with all that going on. What a crazy time that was.
Talk about that storm for a minute, Brian, because, it was just sort of a mystery out there in the Gulf on that Saturday. And it was just strengthening. We really didn't know how much till the planes got out there. So there's some similarities here in what we're going to talk about tonight a little bit.
I mean, obviously it was a different era. I mean, a completely different era. And the only way that they kind of knew how strong it was is, well, eventually they got a barometric pressure reading, but the planes didn't always fly right through the storms back then. And they would look down out the window at the ocean, and that's how they would determine the wind speeds, the estimated wind speeds. So there was no such thing as throwing out dropsondes or anything fancy like that. But they had these ultra low pressure readings. And as a matter of fact, it's the pressure readings really that convinced the Hurricane Center to not the Hurricane Center, but the reanalysis committee to, put it at 175 miles per hour. Because if you look at the 175 actually fits with the storm surge, but if you look at the damage from Camille, of course, it's really hard to distinguish between the storm surge and the wind. But the damage to the trees does not look as severe as the Hurricane Andrew damage does to kind of similar pine trees, So it's an interesting thing, and it really goes to show you that all hurricanes are different, and and how long they blow, of that wind speed and everything else comes into play on how much damage there is. But I went to Florida State, and in February of 1970, a group of us went to Mardi Gras. So we drove US 90 through through the Panhandle, southern Mississippi. When we got to the Biloxi area, the Gulf side of US 90 was gone. So all the traffic was just one lane on either side of what would normally be the westbound side. And from there, you could see there were great mansions along US 90 before that. And all that were left were the stairs going up to what was these incredible mansions. And it was the only time I've seen, and I saw a lot after Hurricane Andrew that was unbelievable. And but there was a stop sign that was bent around the pole and kind of leaning back, but there was some kind of cement pole that the stop sign was on, and the stop sign itself was bent around the pole. So it was one of those incredible events. But Margie Kuiper put together a radar loop a few years ago of that for the anniversary, and it just came together right at the last minute. It had weekend looking at the radar offshore, and then came back together at the last minute and had these incredibly low pressure readings down around 900 millibars. So that's what convinced the reanalysis folks that to go with the 175 miles per hour.
So Troy, did you have any stories from Camille? I know that had to be an influential storm for you as a young person.
Yeah, I was up in Corinth, Mississippi. I think I was in 8th grade. But I so much remember that Sunday night, Brian. Still to this, because WWL was on the air, and listened to WWL a lot of that night from up there in North Mississippi at the time. Really incredible.
Yeah.
I was a 13-year-old kid, Troy, doing the same thing, listening to the same radio station.
Yeah.
All night, Nash Roberts, WWL,
Right. Yeah.
King Edward Cigar Time.
Yeah.
Yep.
WWL from the Roosevelt Hotel in downtown New Orleans.
You got it. And boy, they boomed it. They covered Dixie like the dew at night.
But only till sunrise.
Right.
I listened to them in Florida as well. It was one of the I listen to all these Clear Channel stations. I can tell you the radio station on
Right.
every frequency. I listen
KMOX
to
out of St. Louis. And
right? WABC
KSL
in
or
Chicago, WLS, and
Yep.
Como, and not Como, KAAY in Little Rock, and anyway, it was a whole bunch of them that I used to go between to kind of study what they were doing.
Yeah. So talk about how your career started, how you got into television, Brian.
Well, I was a radio guy. I mean, I always wanted to be a disc jockey. And when I went to Florida State, I got a job at the local top 40 station there, which is also online. You can hear me in January of 1969 playing the jingles and the echo and the whole thing in top 40 radio. It was, I thought, I died and gone to heaven when I got to do that for $1.60 an hour. Anyway, and I did FM radio and WFSU FM. I did other things while I was going to school. I actually owned a stereo store, electronics store, and really put myself through school repairing electronics equipment. But then in the end of my university time, my best friend was working at WFSU TV, the public station there on the campus, as an engineer, a videotape engineer. So videotape machines were run by engineers back then. And the other half of his shift left. So he worked 20 hours and the other 20 hours was available. He said, you should do it. I said, I don't know how to do that. He showed me how to do it. And I convinced him I can do it. And anyway, so I had that job. And then when I graduated with a math major and physics minor and mass communications minor, I thought, what am I going to do? Let me just see if they needed an engineer in Atlanta. So I drove to Atlanta, into Channel 11 in Atlanta, and they needed somebody that day. And so I started as an engineer running videotape and other things, and that evolved into being a maintenance engineer, and then eventually to being a technical director and running master control. And then that evolved into being a director. And then I left there and went to Denver to direct the news, and that evolved into producing the news in Denver. And I produced and directed the 10 o'clock news on Channel 9 in Denver for a year and a half, and that went really well. We got it up to a 48 share, and they sent me to Louisville, to the Gannett station in Louisville, to be news director at WLKY. And I had to, and my weather person, who was a wonderful presenter named Angie Humphreys, she was just really terrific, but she decided to leave. And I decided I wanted a meteorologist to replace her. The other two stations, Wave and WHAS, had meteorologists. And I kept looking and looking, and I kept offering more and more and more money. And I was offering more money than I was making as news director. I thought, this is crazy. that weather, doing the weather on TV, was the confluence of science and broadcasting. Maybe I should do that. So I said, okay, before I'm 30, I'm going to try and see if I can do it. So I went back to Florida State, got a master's, studying meteorology. And it was the first broadcast meteorologist. It was kind of a trial program I got them to create at Florida State. And that was that. And when I graduated, immediately CNN was starting, and they hired me to do the weekends to start CNN.
Yeah, James, say what you were going to say in the chat there, and I want to glom onto that.
As my mind is blown. But yeah, did you do weather on one shift and repair things on another shift? That's amazing.
Well, it was kind of it was something. I mean, there was a lot going on, yeah. But I had like 2 or 3 jobs when I was an undergraduate. When I was a graduate student, which I look back on, and I go, how did I do this? Because I got the graduate degree in one school year, from September to May, and I taught 2 classes, and I did the 5:30 and 11 o'clock weather on Channel 27 in Tallahassee. Somehow.
James A's going to run screaming out of the building here.
How did you do that? I can't even figure out.
It was extreme. Well, what I did, the program that we created, and it was done through the meteorology school at Florida State. It was an interesting time, because when I first went down there and met with Tom Gleason, was his name. He's one of the original Florida State people, along with guy named Chuck Jordan and Neil Lesueur were these people that started meteorology in the early 50s at FSU. And anyway, Tom was a kind of a feisty, wonderful guy, and he was all for attracting broadcast meteorology because that was becoming a thing at Penn State and some other places. Mississippi State was not a thing then. And Florida State was the meteorology school of the South, really, at that time, the big meteorology school in the South. So he was for expanding it and growing it. Well, there were factions in the meteorology department that didn't want to do it and was unpure in some kind of fashion. So Tom made a deal with the dean of the communications department, Dean Clevenger was his name, to create a broadcast meteorology curriculum, which was all of the meteorology, but where there were electives that you could do research and whatnot. I did communications research. So I would go do the weather, and then I would have my students actually call people around. I had the system for randomly calling out of the phone book and ask them how well they understood the weather forecast, depending on which channel they watched, channel 6 or channel 27. And I would evaluate different weather terms. And I wrote kind of a mini thesis. One of my they were called comprehensive exams at the end of the thing. I had 3 comprehensive exams. One of them was on communications. And I wrote, on the results of my research project. So I did that instead of the meteorology research that made it a broadcast meteorology program.
Well, it was a different time, as
was.
James A. was alluding to. Now you have something that I just learned about today called Lazy Apply that can apply for 5,000 jobs a night for you while you're sleeping. So
really,
that tells you how far we
Yes.
have come or how far we've fallen.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's fascinating, Brian. I'm glad you shared all that because we've always jumped into discussions before and never had the chance to examine how your career unfolded, because it was pretty unique and pretty fascinating.
Yeah. And the way, now people know me for hurricanes because I've been, pretty much doing hurricanes here for the last, when did I start that? Officially 2010, I guess. And the way I got into hurricanes had nothing to do with meteorology. I studied tropical meteorology when I got my master's under Neil Lesueur, who was one of the great Bill Gray era minds of tropical meteorology during that time. And but it wasn't a thing for me, especially even though I lived in Florida, and I thought when Hurricane Cleo and Hurricane Betsy came along in the mid 60s, that was really fun. And Donna, and I was in New Jersey for Hurricane Donna in 1960. And my first memory, my oldest memory, is Hurricane Hazel. The power went out in New Jersey, and I thought that was the greatest thing. My mother was in hysterics, but I thought it was fantastic. Anyway, but that wasn't my thing. I was really more interested in just the communications of the weather. And then in the 80s, through a whole confluence of things, I ended up at WPLG in Miami. And I did a thing called neighborhood weather, and which I had created the concept for KNBC in Los Angeles. The idea was to take a news truck and put weather maps on the side of the news truck and go to various parts of Southern California and do the weather from there and call it the neighborhood weather wagon and put the thing in parades and whatnot as a promotional thing. That was my pitch to KNBC, which they did not buy. But I gave it to the news director at WPLG, and he calls me in one day and he said, well, you want to do that neighborhood weather thing at 5:30? I said, sure, let's do it. So for almost 6 years, I did every day, Monday through Friday, a different location and told a different story. And I would produce the stories and do the engineering to make. So we did live from helicopters and elephants and boats and all kind of different places. So I'd have to come up with a story to tell. And I spent a lot of time in the history museum because one of my fallbacks was if I didn't have something going on that was interesting, a new park opening or a new building they built a new high-rise building. I go sit on the edge right at the top, right when it was done, you know, do kind of crazy stuff. But I would go to the history museum and I'm looking through the history of Miami, looking for a picture that happened 65 years ago today. And then go to that location and say, this is what it was 65 years ago today. Here we are today, you know, so forth and so on, and kind of tell a little story and then do the weather. Well, through that process, I kept running across pictures of hurricanes. You know, this is before you could go on the internet and look at the historic hurricanes or something, right? And I go, holy crap, there have been a lot of hurricanes here. And then I thought, you know, if I'm ever chief meteorologist, I better know something about hurricanes, because if they ever start up again here, remember they hadn't happened since the mid 60s. So if they ever start up again, like they happened, you know, there were 7 hurricanes in the first 7 decades of the 20th century where the eye went over downtown Miami 7 times. It's crazy. So I said, you know, I better learn about hurricanes. And so when I became chief meteorologist at WTVJ in 1990, I said, you know, we ought to do hurricanes. There's a lot to say about hurricanes in South Florida. Nobody's paying attention to it. Let's do it. So we learned everything we could about South Florida and hurricanes in that 2.5 years. And then Hurricane Andrew happened. Anyway, that's how I became a hurricane person. It had to do with the history museum. It didn't have anything really to do with meteorology.
Well,
Hey, Brian, how long was the gap between Andrew and the previous major hurricane that affected that area?
27 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
That
So
would do it.
1965 was Hurricane Betsy. The center of it went over Key Largo, but it was a big hurricane, and you know, the waves crashed into the hotels on Miami Beach, ran over Key Biscayne, and so it was a very impactful storm for South Florida, even for the Miami area, even though it was only probably a Category 1 in Miami, but Category 3 in Key Largo.
It kept everything tied up that whole Labor Day weekend, didn't it? Because it was looping out over the Bahamas.
Well, yeah. So, little story about Hurricane Betsy. So I was living in essentially Melbourne Beach. The town is called Indy Atlantic, right across the causeway there from Melbourne. And I was a surfer in 1965. And I went out surfing when Hurricane Betsy was heading north, and they had put up a hurricane watch for North Carolina. And it was offshore of Cape Canaveral. And it was the only time I've ever surfed in big waves. Our boards then, my board was 9'2". It was this giant heavy board. And so I rode a wave, and it was incredible. It's the best. It was like, you know, skiing and coming off the mountain and just dropping down and, you know, and not crashing. So it was great. And then I went back out, and then this big swell was coming, and I headed out, and going up the swell. And what we would do was called turtling. You grab the board and kind of shoot through the wave like that. I love how my camera kind of readjusts. And so I did that, but the wave driven by the hurricane was like concrete, and it knocked me and the board up in the air. And because the only way you could really hurt yourself then was because the boards were so heavy. And so you would jettison the board and dive for the bottom. So I dived for the bottom. I come up and I can't see the land. I'd gone out so far, and getting in through that shore break, there were two sets of breaks actually to get in through, and the incredible undertow. You dive to the bottom and claw on the bottom and hold on, and then when you feel a little bit going forward, jump up and go forward. I was a big jock. I was a gymnast back then, and that's what saved me. So anyway, I had my Hurricane Betsy moment. But the storm went up to Cape Canaveral, stopped, and then turned around. In the meantime, essentially the MIC in Miami had gone on television and said, "There's nothing to worry about from Hurricane Betsy in South Florida. Enjoy your Labor Day weekend." Well, it turned around and came and clobbered Nassau. And then, indeed, was a big surprise. I mean, by the time it got there, it wasn't so much a surprise, but, you know, it had been written off, which is an interesting lesson that they didn't learn from the year before, Hurricane Cleo, where they also said, "Don't worry, it's going to miss us by 22 miles," and it came right over downtown.
James, you got to throw all that chat stuff in there. We can't hold this for our Patreon people.
Man, this is making Dr. Jacobs look like a big slacker. I mean, he goes out and thrashes through some big waves, but he's going to have to step up his game, surf hurricanes with copperheads and black widows and all that stuff all at the same time.
Well, Brian, we need to get into Andrew because that's the storm, of course, that a lot of folks know you for, and your coverage during that was amazing. I've heard some people say that Otis, and I mistakenly, I think all weekend called it Otto. So thank you to you and James, one of our primary listeners, for pointing out that I was doing that somehow, because I've just been too busy and I was a little too sleepy. But talk about that event, because it really was not like Otis necessarily. What were any similarities that you saw?
Well, I mean, the similarity, there were similarities in the timing, although Otis was even a more extreme case. But the eras were so different. So back in 1992, there was no expectation on the part of anybody in the public that you could forecast hurricanes 3 or 4 days in advance. So, whatever the forecast was, it was only a 3-day forecast, but whatever the forecast was, 3 days, the hurricane watch areas, when they finally went up, were huge and took up half of the state of Florida, literally, all the way from Central Florida to the Keys. So, people didn't hang on the details of the forecast in 1992 like they do now in advance. So when Hurricane Andrew finally came into focus, it was that Saturday night, and it hit overnight, Sunday night, early Monday morning. By that time, that time we had Sunday to prepare. We had all day Sunday under beautiful weather to prepare. So when Sunday night came, nobody was thrashing around. I'm not ready. I'm not ready. The streets were empty. The neighborhoods were calm. People were in their place and kind of ready. They thought they were ready. Of course, they weren't ready for that. And it was forecast originally to be a Category 3, and so it was forecast by that time to be a decently strong storm. But it had been 27 years, and nobody really had a feel for it, and certainly didn't. Nobody imagined that could happen. And what it was, the damage was tornado damage. It was EF5 tornado damage. It was winds gusting over 200 miles an hour. But in a 20-mile wide swath. So even in South Florida, where the building code was actually quite good, it wasn't always followed, but the houses that were built to the building code were reasonably strong. But, Andrew was so strong that it exploited all that. So how does that compare to Otis? Well, Andrew was a tropical storm 3 days before landfall, became a Category 1 hurricane 48 hours before landfall. And then the day before landfall, that morning, even that morning, by that Sunday morning, so, less than 24 hours before landfall, the forecast was on southern Dade County in that area. But again, nobody really paid close attention to the details of the forecast. And I didn't actually communicate the details of the forecast. I didn't say, okay, it's forecast to come over Homestead, because a forecast to come over Homestead could have been Fort Lauderdale. The odds were such that it easily could have been. So, but so that was the timing. It really wasn't until Sunday, but Sunday was a preparation day. We had all day Sunday. It was beautiful weather. It was nice. Otis, really, they didn't even have one whole day. The day that it hit, that morning, it still did not seem like a cataclysmic threat. It wasn't until late morning it started to be a little more ominous, and then by afternoon, the forecast settled in. But the other difference is that in 1992 you could actually communicate with people. It's really hard to communicate with people now because in 1992 everybody turned on their television. What else would you do? Right? So you really could easily get to people. You knew you were getting to people. Now you put stuff out there and you think, okay, I got it. Boy, I was really on it. I gave everybody, 24 hours warning or 40 hours, whatever I gave them. But the word everybody has a whole different meaning in this day and age than it did back then. When I'm on Fox Weather and I think we're really covering this well, I go, okay, we've got that much of an audience, and other people have other audiences, and people get these fragments of information. So even if they're watching, they're also getting fragments of information from other places, which is actually diluting what they're getting from me or from other people, and so it's so much more difficult now to communicate.
Well, I watched Mark Suttis' video that afternoon, about 2:00, 3:00, and I knew that it was going to be stronger than anticipated. And I think he was saying it probably would be a Category 3, but I didn't, watch carefully that night and was shocked the next morning, because now we're talking about an intensification of 95 knots, which
yes, right, exactly,
which rivals Wilma,
yeah,
in the Atlantic. And, it was within 10 knots of all these incredible storms, they're 105 knot intensifications like Patricia in the Eastern Pacific. That's just amazing. So kind of walk us through, Brian, what you saw, because you were watching it from Fox Weather. What were the conditions you think were most important to helping the hurricane go through this unexpected rapid intensification?
Well, I was watching it from Fox Weather, but like you, Bill, I went to bed that night and got up in the morning and was shocked, right? I mean, not that I didn't think it was going to be pretty strong. I actually thought that it was more likely to go a little north of Acapulco, that it could, because it was a small storm, and you got to, when it's a small storm, a lot of things come into play. One of them is that you got to be kind of stupid unlucky to get the worst of it on you, right? So, I mean, to have a little small storm happen to hit this city that isn't that huge is really, really super unfortunate and unlucky. But the other thing with small storms, which like Hurricane Andrew and like Camille and Charlie, is that they can spin up very quickly. They don't need a lot of conducive atmosphere, and they can also die quickly, right? So the water, there's a wedge of water off Acapulco, which is normally warm, and it was quite warm. And because the storm was so small, it was able to take advantage of that and this pocket of atmosphere. Well, the other thing about small storms is the models don't resolve them especially well. And so they're not as well forecast as big storms are. And the other thing is that because Acapulco has never had a hurricane like this, and they haven't really had a direct hit of a hurricane coming in from the Pacific. There was a hurricane paralleling the coast that dumped a lot of rain, did a lot of damage in 97, I think it was, but it was 51 since the last time a hurricane came in just north of the city that actually brought, this kind of a dynamic to the city. So Acapulco is built for earthquakes, not for high winds. So you have this horrible confluence of things, and they don't even have a radar there. So you have this data void. It's a hike for the hurricane hunters. So they didn't think it was going to be strong. So they only sent one plane out, and thank goodness they did that and got that information on that afternoon. But it was just, it's why do planes crash? Well, it's never one thing, right? It's a whole lot of things go wrong. And in this case, the small storm, poorly resolved in the models, a pocket of conducive atmosphere, not much data, all those things, and a city not prepared for hurricanes at all, let alone Category 4 or 5 hurricane.
And our email officer has a question from one of our fabulous listeners, James Lewis. So, Jim, why don't you ask that? I think it's the third question. I just put it in chat because it's appropriate right here.
Yeah, James came in with several questions. And so this one is, with no recon in the last 10 hours before landfall, no radar, and so far no data from the eye of the hurricane near or after landfall, How much uncertainty is there likely to be in the track and intensity of the hurricane? Will data from the few stations that collected data around the time of landfall, analysis of the damage on the ground, and satellite-based estimates be enough for a robust estimate of the location and intensity at landfall?
Well, there is a wind report of 203 mile per hour gust. Now, I assume that they're going to take that that anemometer sort of thing. It's one of those audio anemometers that actually measures the wind speed by sound waves, and actually calibrate it and see if if it says 203, what does it really mean, and what does it really mean when there's heavy rain? So these devices are used to measure rainfall as well, and how all that correlates is sort of like the SFMRs that they use to figure out the wind speed from the hurricane hunters by the radiation coming from the sea foam. Calibrating that to rain and so forth is a never-ending scientific process. So I suspect that measurement and maybe other measurements that were taken during the storm is going to help. Looking at the damage, you would say, okay, this had to be a Category 5. Look at this, but that's not knowing what the construction standards were. So just like in tornado world, they're going to have to go in there and evaluate those high-rise buildings that were just ripped apart. Were they held together by staples, or were they actually nailed and decent cladding put on the building or not? But yeah, everything will be evaluated, including the model data, to try and understand exactly what was detected. Looking back on it, there were hints, but certainly none of the models got it before that day, the day of the event.
Another question for you. Is there anything further back in the records for a major hurricane striking that part of the coast, or is this really a first of its kind event for that area?
As far as I know, there's nothing. The records for the Eastern Pacific go back to 1949. There's that 1951 storm. I'm pretty sure it's 51. I think that's it. That's it in terms of storms coming in. Somebody help me. The 97 storm, is it Janice? A J storm, I think, that paralleled. And in Acapulco, you have along the beach there, the coast, you have those high rises, and it's the tourist area. Then inland, you have kind of higher terrain, and it's a poorer part of the city. Well, the super heavy rain fell in the poorer part of the city, and that was really devastated, and it was a big disaster there. But it didn't really affect the tourist area because it was a paralleling storm, was just the way the rain band set up, apparently. But there, if you look at the tracks and there are Category 5 hurricanes in the Eastern Pacific on occasion, but they curve in mostly to the north, in northern Mexico, and some to the south, but none in that part of the coast where Acapulco is.
Brian, in 1975, I was a 13-year-old studying Hurricane Eloise as it came into the Florida Panhandle, and that night before landfall, it did intensify pretty quickly and turn to the northeast. It always seemed to me that there may have been a trough somewhere behind that. Did you observe that? Is that the general thinking? And I've heard people say that the trough to the north of Otis may have had an impact.
Yeah, you have this thing called good trough, bad trough. If the trough is too close, it creates shear over the top of the storm and it tilts it. If the trough is just far enough away, it helps evacuate air from the storm. And you also, with landfalling storms, the Gulf Coast, a lot of Gulf Coast storms weaken when they get close to the coast, especially if they have any size to them, because as soon as they get near the coast, they're pulling air off of the land, and usually that air is dry. And so you get that. But a small storm that doesn't, the way the trajectory of the wind is, if it doesn't get that, and when you get into Mexico, if it's very big, you have downsloping wind that comes over the mountains and dries, and it's even more so than in the Gulf. But if it's small, when it gets near the coast, relatively near the coast, the friction of the coastline actually can intensify it because it bends the winds to the left. And so that actually tightens it up to a point until it gets closer to the coast. So when we look at Otis, we see that happening. We see it intensify just offshore, and then we see it starting to weaken, whether the atmospherics are changing or it is now air coming off the land and downsloping into the system that's causing that little weakening in the IR. Whether that actually weakened the winds at the surface, that's a whole other question, but we can see the structure deteriorating slightly in that last several hours before landfall.
I saw a little transitory feature on the GFS a couple of times this weekend, and it made me think, was there something at play like that? With a little small jetlet or streak right there in the vicinity of Acapulco. Was that in the vicinity that day, or was that just a coincidence later?
Yeah, I don't know, Bill. I don't remember. I remember the trough to the north, but the consensus was that this thing was just going to that the shear was going to be high enough to keep it at a relatively low intensity, and essentially that trough was going to drive it inland before it had a chance to intensify. And it goes to show that with small storms, it really is on a knife's edge. We saw that. In fact, it was a very similar scenario to Michael.
Mm-hmm.
That Michael was not forecast to intensify because there was a big trough that was causing significant shear, but Michael was just outside the shear, and the shear was not at the level to keep Michael from intensifying. So it's just on that. The relatively small diameter storms was on a hairy edge there of the trough, where the trough actually enhanced it as opposed to damaging the potential for intensification.
So Brian, were you monitoring the hurricane when the Hurricane Hunters report came back? How surprising was that to you and other forecasters?
Yeah, I was. I was, but honestly, I don't focus on Pacific hurricanes like I do on Atlantic hurricanes. Obviously, I don't focus, all day. So I wrote a piece the morning before, or the morning of the evening that it hit. And I said, intensify, Acapulco has to watch it, or something like that. It wasn't an oh my God kind of piece at all. And then that afternoon, when I saw the Hurricane Hunters and the Weather Service, or the National Hurricane Center, put out a special advisory, I thought, oh, wow. But I had in my mind, I don't know what I was doing that day, but I was busy with something. And I had in my mind that, well, thank God this is going to miss Acapulco, because it was really looked like, from all the model guidance the day before and the cone and everything, it looked like it was going to be north of there. It was another one of these storms that stayed to the left of the cone, a la Hurricane Ian, right? Went down the left side or the right side of the cone. I'm sorry, went down the right side of the cone. Charlie and some others.
Yeah, that's true. So have you talked to anyone who is in the modeling field? I wish we had Dr. Jacobs here tonight. What do you think the models missed to cause them to under forecast the hurricane's intensity?
I think two things. One is they generally don't do well with the resolution of the models we have today. They just generally don't do well with small storms. But also, there really is a data void there. We didn't have, for the models that ran, the 12Z models that ran on the morning of the landfall, there was no data. There wasn't, we didn't get Hurricane Hunter data till that afternoon. With no radar, limited observations, we don't have, we just don't have information out there that of the same level that we have in the Atlantic or the Gulf. So, I think that it was more the why planes crash kind of thing, that it really was this confluence of everything that could go wrong did go wrong. That was this small storm in a real data void. I would think that if something like this happened in the future, I don't know what the protocols are. I have no idea. Actually, it'd be an interesting question on hurricane hunters in the Pacific and when they send them and when they don't, and why they didn't send it earlier this time. Maybe because they were, confident that it was going to be a tropical storm, and why. Well, I don't know. I just don't know what the limitations are. So, but I can imagine that in the future that they would try and get more data sooner on a potential threat. Just a guess.
Another question from our friend James Lewis. If research is able to determine what data was missing that could have helped forecast the extraordinary intensification of Otis, what could actually be done about it? And then how much would it cost, for instance, to put more buoys in the area? Would all that need to be paid for by Mexico? And how difficult would be an extra recon mission by the U.S. hurricane hunters have been? Very great questions there.
Yeah, well, the two kinds of recon, of course. One is the hurricane hunters that fly through the storm, but the other is the jet that flies around the storm to get the environment. And my sense is that's what was missing, is we didn't have a good understanding of the environment. Now, somebody's got to analyze this, so I'm doing this just from a imagination standpoint. But the thing about the Atlantic and the Gulf is we have land to the west. The thing about the Eastern Pacific is we have nothing to the west to speak of. Hawaii that we have to the west, right? So the kind of data that we have over the Pacific is much more sparse. So I would think, now I can't off the top of my head recall them sending the jet to the Pacific to sample the environment around the storm. I don't know if the jet can fly that far. I just don't know. But it would be an interesting question to ask the hurricane hunter folks or the NOAA folks. The jet is a NOAA jet, actually, to understand that better. But my sense is that's what was not well detected, is exactly the depth of the trough, exactly the pattern, the upper air pattern around the storm. Bill, I lost your audio.
Yeah, I muted there for a second. Sorry
Okay.
about that.
Okay.
Have you seen this paper that came out, Brian, about rapid intensification being in two camps, sort of a sprint and a marathon? Have you seen that paper?
Yeah. Yes, we were talking about that. The whole rapid intensification thing is such an interesting problem. In fact, all these papers, there are a number of papers that have been out relatively recently that have talked about how hurricanes are changing, more often rapidly intensifying. And I think there's a general consensus that in a warmer world, we're going to see more rapid intensification. But a lot of these papers, and there was one that got a lot of press recently, and it wasn't the one you talked about, Bill. It was the one that was comparing what was the point? Anyway, it talked about storms of hurricane type all over the planet and how they were changing, but it was comparing, started in 1981. And the thing was, we know that through the 80s and into the 90s, we had a cooler Atlantic because of air pollution from Europe, that when the Clean Air Acts all went into effect, the air cleared up. We also had volcanoes and so forth. So storms didn't behave the same way in the 70s and 80s that they do in the modern world. And so making comparisons and judgments based on that era, in my mind, is scientifically questionable, or at least you have to qualify it somehow. And then when you qualify it, it feels like to me that you're not necessarily making your point. So I've all these papers that compare, and I can't remember the details of the one that you mentioned, but I remember the paper, but I don't remember if that was one of the ones that used that era of less hurricane activity and fewer stronger storms as a benchmark.
Yeah, it's an interesting paper, and I hope we'll have the author and some of his colleagues on the show here pretty soon. The thing that concerned me when I woke up the next morning is I'd always thought this might happen along the Gulf Coast or the Atlantic coast of the United States. But it seems like realistically, with less of a data void, and of course the emphasis of the G4 and all those type tools that we have, is it less likely or is it still just as possible in your estimation, Brian?
Well, I think it's less likely, but I don't think even if they had the information that would have forecast the Category 5. Now, the thing is that the fact of the matter is, if they forecast the Category 3, every hurricane preparation that is possible should be put into effect, right? You wouldn't prepare more for a Category 5 than you do for a Category 3, except maybe in an evacuation sense, I guess. There are some areas that have different evacuations if they know it's going to be a Category 5. But in general, the Hurricane Center would never forecast that kind of intensification under any circumstances anyway. But I think that that they would more likely get it to a 3 or a 4 or something like that, so that the discussion would be, we are in full hurricane preparation mode in the affected area. I think it's very unlikely that we would have a situation that we wouldn't have some kind of significant warning. However, the problem is if you have a Hurricane Andrew scenario, you can talk about the fact that this could intensify to a Category 3 or Category 4 here in 2 days, but it's a tropical storm or it's a Category 1, and how much traction will you get with that message when they can see the storm? Here we are, and it looks disorganized, and they're saying it's 70 miles an hour or it's 80 miles an hour, and you're saying, oh, we're going to evacuate for a Category 4 or a Category 5. Is anybody, or what percentage of people are going to believe it or take action, or they're going to wait and see? I think there's going to be a lot of waiting and seeing, and so the odds of us, even in the U.S., being prepared for a fast developing storm, I think, are low. And the fact is, if they had known, this wasn't a big storm that killed a lot of people with storm surge because of the terrain there. If they had known that it was going to be a super hellacious, horrible storm, maybe some people would have gotten to a safer spot, but there wasn't that. There's no place to go. It's not like there can be a big evacuation from there. It's a relatively poor place, and the tourists in general were in hotels that survived and so forth. So it wasn't, in this case, it wasn't a case so much of oh my God, we killed thousands of people because this storm did this. That could very well happen in the U.S. though, even with better forecasts, but just the reality of communications and convincing somebody to take extreme action for a storm that's not super strong. You're muted, Bill.
I was muting there for James. James, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, Brian, you talked a little bit about using historical hurricane data from the 70s and 80s and 90s. And it strikes me that this is a little bit different than comparing, say, highs and lows going back to the 1970s, because this is such a small frequency event when you're talking a Category 4 or Category 5 storm. It's almost like you're trying to plot changing frequencies of a very low, changing occurrences of a very low frequency thing on a fabric, the longer term change that's happening here. But it's also kind of all we have aside from modeling.
Well, yeah, although you have to ask yourself, are you better off looking at the hurricane record from the 70s and 80s, where you do have better data? We have satellite data. But we know that we have this blanket over top of the Atlantic that was changing the character of hurricanes. So is that better? Or are we better off going farther back where we have good landfall data? We don't know exactly, but we know that hurricanes were making landfall. We know what happened and when they happened and so forth. And we know that there was, like I said, in Miami, this incredible frequency of storms. And you had two in 1906, and then big hurricanes in the Keys in the teens, and then these monster hurricanes that hit in the 20s, and the incredible hurricanes in the 30s. And then in 1945, 47, 48, 49, and 50, what we call today Category 4 hurricanes hit South Florida. 5 and 6 years, and 2 of those years had second hurricanes as well, and then the hurricanes of the 60s. So, this was a frequent event in South Florida up until the 70s, up until the late 60s, actually. So, what part of the record, in my mind, what part of the record is the best to compare? I always, that's what was my pitch when I became chief meteorologist in 1990. I said, look, I didn't know why the hurricanes had stopped. Back then we thought, and Dr. Bill Gray, who was, such this wonderful, wonderful person that we all knew, talked about the thermohaline circulation and the salt content of the Gulf Stream and so forth. And that all seemed plausible. And that, I'm not saying that isn't a component of an oscillation, but, people are pretty convinced, I think, scientifically now proven, I would say, that the 70s and 80s decrease was significantly caused or enhanced by the pollution from Europe, in the same way that it was very polluted in the United States as well during those years. So how you use the historical data is, in my mind, a big question. And I think it's overused and over relied on for exactly the reasons you say. As a matter of fact, since Hurricane Andrew, I got involved in insurance in South Florida. I was appointed by Bill Nelson, who was the insurance commissioner at the time, to a committee to try and solve the insurance problem. And we failed, actually, because the insurance system in Florida is essentially in collapse. But I came out of that thinking, okay, let's define insurance here for a second. Seems to me to insure something, it has to happen frequently enough that an actuary can say, okay, here's how much our average losses are going to be, like people getting car accidents or fires or people dying or whatever. Here's how often that's going to happen. Here's our profit. Here's divided by the number of customers, whatever. This is how much we got to charge, right? That's how insurance works. But for exactly the reasons you said, James, that you can't do that with hurricanes. They don't occur in any kind of regularity and frequency. You can do that, but on the other hand, that's what we do. That's how they charge for hurricane insurance. And so what this stuff that we buy in Florida is not really insurance. It's really trying to create a pile of money that we hope can offset some of the losses. And then they go through all kinds of gyrations to, offset fewer of the losses. And it's a big problem that, I suggested a solution to it nearly 20 years ago now, but this is the problem. Exactly what you said. Hurricanes are different. They're not like, it's sort of like saying, let's talk about the hurricane frequency of Moore, Oklahoma. Yeah. Okay. Moore gets tornadoes, or the tornado frequency. Moore gets tornadoes, but what can you say? How often when's the next tornado coming to Moore? There is no way to say, because it's a stochastic kind of thing. It's, you just know that it is in a tornado zone belt.
And with the 70s and 80s downturn, that also overlaid a huge buildup in vulnerable property along the coasts in Florida too, which also throws off that curve of insurance. And the more you build it up, the more valuable it gets because you're getting into some scarcity there too. So
Right.
Good luck. I don't know how you solve that now.
Well, I mean, my suggestion for solving it is the way they solved it with, which they never have completely solved, but the philosophy of flood insurance, although not completely. But the idea that the federal government would set a cap and say, okay, private insurance up to a certain level, and then we'll have the catastrophic insurance above that. And that would allow the private insurance people to know they're not going to go out of business if 2 hurricanes happen in the same year, right? That up to a certain amount in a year or whatever, that would be just private insurance. I think it's the only way, because the fact is, if we have a big hurricane like a Katrina or a Sandy or a whatever, the federal government writes a $50 billion check anyway. So why not just go ahead and say, okay, we'll cover it if it's catastrophic. If it's not catastrophic, the private companies can carry that, but you don't have to. Private companies don't have to worry about it being catastrophic and driving them out of business. So they've done lots of gyrations. For instance, in the state of Florida, every major company that you can think of, they're only in the state of Florida. So if they have to go bankrupt, the national company doesn't go bankrupt. The state of Florida company goes bankrupt. And so it stops all that stuff. You could control all that stuff, and then you could also help the building code situation to be sure that municipalities and whatnot were building to the right standards. If you created a system that lowered the insurance costs in exchange for everybody doing the right thing.
I've got kind of a historical footnote question about South Florida hurricanes. What happened with the one I've read about in the 1920s or 30s that flooded Lake Okeechobee, and the death toll was horrendous? What happened with that storm?
So that was the 1928 storm. So that was a Category 5 over Puerto Rico that took essentially the same track that Maria took, diagonal across the island, except it was Category 5, not 4. And it was just devastating in Puerto Rico. And then it came up, and this was 2 years after the Great Miami Hurricane. In 1926 was the storm that, if it were to happen again, is estimated that it would be the most expensive hurricane in history, estimated to be a $300 billion hurricane, because it was a giant hurricane. So the center of it came ashore, I think about 10 miles south of downtown Miami. And it took out from Miami to Fort Lauderdale and all the way up into the Palm Beaches flooded. So all of Southeast Florida flooded, and the city of Hollywood was essentially destroyed. Dania was essentially destroyed up in Broward County, let alone Miami. The ocean came over Miami Beach, about 3 feet deep in sand in Miami Beach. So that was the September storm. There had been a July storm that just missed Southeast Florida. And then there was another one, a big one that came over Cuba in October. And it was such a big scare that people flocked to the Weather Bureau. We're trying to crowd into the Weather Bureau, and we're crowding on trains to get out of town. Everybody was so scared of the October storm, but it just missed the coast. So everybody was kind of freaked out by hurricanes there. And then here comes this Category 5 from Puerto Rico coming right up toward South Florida. Well, it ended up going over the Palm Beaches, over Palm Beach and West Palm Beach, and essentially destroyed what was there in West Palm Beach. Tremendous damage there. But the thing was that it was another giant hurricane. And as we saw with Katrina, giant hurricanes move a lot of water, right? You have this big sweep of wind. So when it came so that the north wind came over Lake Okeechobee, it pushed the water from the north of the lake through the south of the lake. And at that time, the dike that was on the south of the lake to control the water that flowed into the farming communities that had been developed south of the lake, it just overtopped that. So this incredible surge came and just washed through those towns. And they were mostly farm workers, a lot of Black farm workers and immigrant farm workers of various kinds. So the death toll was never totally clear. There are estimates of 2,500 to 3,200 to some more. And, it was a horrible thing. I mean, you can imagine there were just bodies everywhere. And then because there were a lot of Black folks involved, they were buried in a big grave in West Palm Beach, and exactly how many people were buried and what happened to everybody. And, that's not really well known.
So, Brian, you mentioned lots of research going to be coming up the next couple of years at all the hurricane meetings. What do you think's priority, and what would you see as our next most important steps?
Well, I think to be honest with you, I think that what's happened in the modern world is the communications. If you look at some kind of skill scale, the communications is down here and the science is up here, right? I mean, we do so much better at forecasting. I used to say that the folks at the National Hurricane Center that are making the forecast are rarely surprised by what happens. Now, Otis changed that, but and so did Philippe. Another one. The errors this year are going to be the worst errors in maybe a decade, in terms of the 4 or 5 day errors in track. A lot of that was caused by Philippe. That, remember, they forecasted to go up there and it went over there, right? And just completely different direction. It was kind of in a coal there, and then it was affected by the one. What was the one right behind it? The name is escaping me, but anyway, it had this other interaction with another storm and blah 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 that helped keep it south. So anyway, so that's what I said up until this year. But so we need to revise that. So it's rare that the folks at the Hurricane Center are surprised by what happens, but it's rare that the people that are affected are not surprised by what happens. So in my mind, that's the gap that we have to close, is that and I don't, I'm a communications guy and I don't have a good suggestion on how we do it. But clearly, data is the solution to getting forecasts better. But honestly, I think forecasts are good enough for if we could communicate the forecasts we have, we would go a long way to solving the hurricane readiness problem if we get people to understand them and believe them. And believing them is probably half of the issue.
Jen, you got 2 more questions from Mr. Lewis.
I do. First one here, and this can go to Brian and then to anybody else on the panel who would like to answer. But James says, I have seen people complain about the lack of media coverage for the disaster. What does the panel think of this? Do you think there is a lack of media coverage?
For the Acapulco disaster, I guess they mean, yes, I absolutely do. I mean, it's always been this way. When something incredible happens and there's a war going on, there's some other O.J. Simpson trial or something going on, and anything can blot out coverage of especially in a non-U.S. city. It kind of happened with Hurricane Michael. Panama City didn't get the coverage that you would have thought it would have gotten. I don't remember what all was happening then, but something was happening then. So yes, absolutely. The scale of devastation in Acapulco was tremendously underreported.
Yeah. Anybody else have any thoughts on that? I would agree on that. The last question from our listener, James Lewis, with the death toll still coming in, I have to ask whether Mexico counts hurricane deaths the same way as in the U.S. In the U.S., of course, deaths may include heart attacks or deaths related to cleanup and even ones related to preparing for the hurricane. Do other countries also count these, or is that mostly in the U.S.?
I don't know the answer to that. There are 2 different kinds of deaths. In the U.S., we do count direct deaths that are caused by the event itself, by the strong winds, the storm surge, and the threats from the hurricane. And then we have indirect deaths, which are all those other ones, from heart attacks to traffic accidents to everything else. So we do that in the U.S., but how Mexico is going to account for that. I don't know. Generally, in a city like that, they're going to know how many people directly died. The indirect thing to do with water pollution and all the different things that can happen, that's a much more difficult problem, I would think.
Brian, you recall too that recently in Guam with the typhoon out there that if you recall, they had 2 or 3 deaths due to people that had gone out surfing on that water, and it was decided by the governor that they were not going to count those as as typhoon fatalities.
Yeah, that's more suicide, I guess. Yeah. Although normally I say let the surfers be, because generally the surfers, nobody's going to go out and surf. I mean, I did. I was stupid,
Right.
but that it was out of my element. But generally, the surfers can handle themselves. We have other people to worry. I said that in Andrew on the air. I said, "Don't worry about the surfers. Leave them alone. We've got bigger problems than them. Nobody's going to come rescue them if they get in trouble anyway."
So Brian, it seems like the west coast of Mexico just couldn't catch a break this year. How much of that was El Nino in your estimation?
Well, the thing is, Bill, that the water off of much of the west coast of Mexico was cold. We had that El Nino. We have the El Nino down at the equator, but then there was this kind of cold tongue up near the Southern California coast and up into, I don't know how far south that went, but in general, El Nino years, we have more active storms, stronger storms in the Eastern Pacific. So there may have been some component there, but we did have that significant cold tongue of water just to the north.
A couple of fun, quick questions, because it's been a very serious subject. If any of the panelists have anything, please jump in. And then James always asks the hard questions, Brian, so we'll come to that. But tell us about Bob Sheets. We've never talked about him enough on this show. And he was an amazing man. Of course, we've gotten to talk to Max Mayfield and loved him, but talk about Bob for a minute.
Well, Bob was my hero of Hurricane Andrew. I mean, Bob held not just the Hurricane Center together, but really everything together. I couldn't have done Hurricane Andrew without him. We had a direct connection, a direct microwave link to the Hurricane Center, and every opportunity we had to talk to Bob, we did. But I saw Bob. I went up to his house to interview him for the 30th anniversary of Hurricane Andrew, and we spent a couple hours together, which was wonderful. I hadn't seen him in a number of years, but I mean, he really was. He was the hero of that storm. Is the way that and what he did. Well, first of all, he was there continuously, writing advisories and whatnot. He was there continuously, and his home was in the disaster zone. And he, as soon as he could after the storm, he drove home down. I don't even know how he did it, because the road US 1 going south from the Hurricane Center was so blocked, but somehow he got through the check on his home and his daughter's home, which was even farther south in Lakes by the Bay. And he had a tree on the house and whatnot, but the house survived, and he actually lived there through the whole process. Then he came back to the Hurricane Center, so he was up for like 48 hours continuously, and saw it through the track into Louisiana. It was a tour de force. It really was his effort and performance during that storm.
Brian, I've got a question for you. Kind of saved it till the end. I've read your book, and as most people have, but after all these years with Hurricane Andrew, and we talked with Jen, about the stories, what's the one thing that you remember about Andrew that is still as strong today, maybe, as it the day it happened?
Well, I mean, it's the people I encountered, the individual. I mean, I'll tell you about two, and I wrote about them in the book because they were so profound. One was that in the week after the storm, when the tent city had been set up, I went down there to broadcast, actually do the weather and interviews and whatnot from there. And I think we were shooting something. Oh, I know what it was. People magazine was actually going to take a picture of me, and there's a picture you see around of me standing in front of the rubble that was shot by the People magazine photographer. Anyway, but I did the weather down there at the same time. And the People photographer he said, okay, we got the tent city pictures. Can we go into the neighborhoods? Maybe we'll find somebody. So we walked down, I think it's 12th Avenue in Homestead, from the park, Harris Field Park, where the tent city was. And we saw this woman standing in the doorway, kind of looking at us. And so we went up to her and I said, how are you? And she had a little girl next to her and said, no, we're okay. And, but she was very kind of blank, this very, and so she said, do you want to come in? And so we went in, and in the living room, the carpet was wet. It's just soggy, and there was a mattress on the living room floor, and there's all debris everywhere. And this little girl, looked to be maybe 6 or 7, was walking around in bare feet. And the mother pointed up the stairs. It was like a 2-story condo kind of thing. And I would go up the stairs, and I turned on the stairs, and there was no second floor. So it would rain and the water would wash down the stairs into the living room. And this is what was happening. And this is where they were living. And anyway, so we weren't there very long, but I talked to her, and she was just, like in shock. That's what it looked like. So anyway, we went back to the tent city, and I found one of the military people, and I gave him the address, and I said, please go down there, because I think I had told her, you should go to the tent city. They'll take care of you. They'll help you. They'll feed you. They'll give you a place, but with no response, I said, so I don't know whatever happened. I know, but I can picture all that like it was yesterday. The other was the following October. I was the Grand Marshal of Fantasy Fest in Key West, which is this huge Halloween event, crazy with a capital K. And so I was pretty well known in South Florida at the time. And so I really couldn't go out in public in amongst the, overserved population of Fantasy Fest. So, but I was going to do the weather at 11 o'clock on the Friday night before that big thing on the weekend from Duval Street. And I was staying down at the Pier House, and I had my little sailor suit, and I was going to get my face painted while I was doing the weather. And so I snuck up Simonton, which is a street off of Duval in the shadows and whatnot, and came around to the big remote truck. We had a big remote truck that had a editing suite inside it and stairs that went up. And I ran over to the remote truck, up the stairs, and banging on the door to get in. And there's people behind me yelling, Brian, Brian, Brian. And I'm just kind of ignoring them. And I go in, and because I had to call Miami and make my notes for the weather maps and all the stuff that I was going to do it by remote. And then they start banging on the door. And I say to the engineer, please tell them to stop. Tell them I'm working here. I can't. So I'm like timing it, looking at my watch going, okay, I got to do the weather at, the tease is at like 11:08 or something. And I'm looking. And finally I have to go. And so I go out the door, like all steeled for like people, Anyway, it was this girl and this guy. And to this day, I don't know if they were boyfriend, girlfriend, brother, sister, or what they were. I get down to the bottom of those stairs, and they go, we have to talk to you. We have to talk to you. I go, what? And they said, we were watching you, and you said, get under the mattress, and we get under the mattress, and the plate glass window crashed on the bed, and we'd be dead. And it was like this, one of these stories. And the mattress thing was the best thing I ever said in my life. And anyway, we stood there in the middle of Duval Street with them hugging and crying, on my way to go get my face painted and do the 11 o'clock weather. It was, I never heard from them again, but it was a moment.
Thanks for sharing, Brian. Appreciate it.
What a great couple of stories.
Yeah.
Brian, I really admire what the folks over at Fox Weather are doing. I've really enjoyed watching their coverage. Talk about that for a minute. How is it going over there? And put a bug in a couple of the anchors' ears. We'd love to have them on the show sometime.
Oh, well, I'm sure they'd be happy to do it. Yeah, it's great. It really is. It's a great team. I really enjoy working with them. It's a new operation, so we're doing, all kinds of new things. Everybody is receptive to new ideas and ways to do things. They cover the crap out of stuff because they have the back end resources. So it's been really a pleasure. I have absolutely no complaints. Not that I've been really lucky. I've worked with wonderful people my whole career. Television is pretty horrible business for a lot of folks, and really, deteriorated badly. And, I feel like I rode some kind of wave because by the time it started getting dicey, I had credibility. And so, I was able to kind of blast through the problems and get past them. So I really do feel lucky, and this is no exception. They're great folks, and they the idea that people can watch us on their phone anywhere. It's amazing how many people I hear from in Europe and that actually watch the channel because they have interest in the US, and so they want to see it, or Estonia, or anywhere. People can watch, and obviously on Roku and Apple TV and on many cable systems now. More and more cable systems actually have it as a regular sort of channel on the cable as well.
Yeah, Mike Rollins, I've known for a long time, and he's a big cog up there in that machine. And
he is. He is
loving it
all the time. Yeah, we have a great time.
Excellent.
Brian, I haven't had any questions this evening, but just want to say thanks for being here. I could listen to this all night. You've had an incredible career, and it's just amazing what you've done and what you've been through. And I know we appreciate it, and keep on keeping on.
All right, thank you, Bill. Appreciate it.
So Brian, is it time to make an adjustment to the Saffir-Simpson scale? Everybody talks about this every year. Is it time to have an enhanced scale? Change it? What do you think?
No, I'm not for that, honestly, James. The problem with the Saffir-Simpson scale is that, there's this natural tendency, especially in the modern world where messaging is so short, that we want to boil everything down to a number, and the hurricanes don't lend themselves to that, because the Saffir-Simpson scale is a wind scale. And obviously, if you have a storm surge storm, where storm surge is the main killer, the main threat, the wind and the storm surge don't jibe. But there have been a lot of efforts to try and figure out what to use instead, and how you could combine these threats. But the thing is, by trying to combine the threats into a simplified scale number, whatever, you simplify the problem. And the problem is not a simple problem. You don't want people to take a passing interest in a coming hurricane. You want people to actually go, oh crap, I need to learn more, because they're not going to make good decisions if they're not better informed. So, I'm not, to me, a Category 5 hurricane, the meaning of it is that pretty much everything is going to get damaged or destroyed. And, what do we need beyond that? A Category 5 hurricane is equivalent to an EF5 tornado in terms of wind gusts, right? You're going to get 200 mile per hour plus wind gusts. So I don't know, I don't think that you can really make communications progress by monkeying with the Saffir-Simpson scale. There are bigger systemic issues.
And do you think people are paying attention to the storm surge warning product that comes out now?
No, I think that's going to take time. It's a relatively, as we know, new product. And the thing is, this whole issue we have in the United States is we use these words. Warning is one of them. So when Hurricane Sandy, or what became Superstorm Sandy, was coming toward the northeast, and if you recall, the Hurricane Center didn't put up warnings north of North Carolina because they thought it was going to be post-tropical, and therefore they were going to use the various National Weather Service alerting techniques. And they did, but there was excellent research done. It was a team of scientists, including Dr. Jay Baker from Florida State. And in real time, they talked to people about what alerting they were aware of along the coast there. And I don't know, 75 or 80% of the people said, oh, yeah, either they were under a watch or a warning, which they were under neither. But they were under a watch because everybody was saying watch out. And they were under a warning because, of course, they were warning us every minute on television, right? So for normal people, the words mean the dictionary meaning. They don't mean the technical meaning anyway. So we have to get people just used to being warned for storm surge. I don't think the storm surge warning as a product is the issue so much, just the fact that people have to get used to the fact that storm surge is a threat. We went for so long where we didn't have storm surge storms. Storms, just the way hurricanes were hitting, they weren't hitting in places producing big storm surge in high profile places. Obviously, with Katrina and Sandy and others, changed that significantly.
So one more, and we got to take a break in a second. But I want to get some advice, Brian. A lot of young meteorologists listen to this show. Let's say that they're a college grad, they've got their first job, and they're working in Corpus Christi, Myrtle Beach, some coastal market. What advice could you give them when it comes to communicating risk during an approaching hurricane? You have an amazing communication skill set. You're the best of the best. What advice can you give a younger meteorologist that wants to be like you?
Don't get trapped by the maps. Don't get trapped by the data. Figure out what your story is. What is the point you're trying to make, and make that point 3 times. And don't try and make 10 points. I don't use the models in the way that most people use the models. To me, I don't want people to think that we don't know what's going to happen. So I see so many broadcasters say, here's the GFS, here's the European, it could be anything. Where in my day, we had to make a forecast. So, when it comes to a significant threat, I want people to know what to be ready for, and showing models without a reason, without a story behind them. Sometimes I'll show them to say, okay, notice the model. So this tells us that the threat zone is from here all the way over to here. So don't get fooled by the cone. The cone can be misleading you in this case, because this is a situation where we have above average uncertainty, and this is a way to demonstrate that. So what is the point that you want to leave them with, and make that point at least 3 times in your broadcast, and then people are more likely to take it away from what you're saying.
Excellent advice. So we got to pause very quickly. We're going to hit, in fact, I don't believe Tony has a report this week. So we're going to get This Week in Tornado History from Jen. We're going to come back with Weather Roundup. We'll talk about the current tropical situation. We'll do Picks of the Week, Brian. So come up with a good pick for us, and much more as WeatherBrains rolls along.
This week in tornado history. During the early morning of November 6, 2005, a devastating tornado traveled just over 41 miles from near Smith Mills, Kentucky, through southern Evansville, Indiana, northeast to near Gentryville, Indiana. The tornado crossed the Ohio River 3 times. A summary from the National Weather Service in Paducah states that 25 were killed. It was the deadliest tornado to hit Indiana since 1974. 20 of the deaths occurred at a large mobile home park near Interstate 164 on the south side of Evansville in Vanderburgh County. There were 350 mobile homes at the park, 100 were destroyed, and 125 damaged. It was a horrifying scene. Several bodies were carried almost 200 yards, and many were found near a nearby retention pond. There was an 8-year-old boy who was found alive in a ditch. He had been trapped under debris for over 12 hours. In Warwick County, a teenage girl was killed in a vehicle south of Boonville. In Dagonia Springs, 3 people, including a woman 8 months pregnant, died in a mobile home. There were over 230 injuries, and per the National Weather Service summary, 20 were critical and 63 resulted in hospital admissions. The tornado lasted 45 minutes. It began at 1:39 in the morning Central Standard Time and ended at 2:24 a.m. At least 500 homes or buildings were completely destroyed or severely damaged. Much of the damage was upper F2 or lower F3 intensity. You can read about this event and many more at our website, tornadotalk.com.
Looking beyond the atmosphere, here's Tony Rice with your astronomy outlook.
Well, we fell back again on Sunday, so be careful out there. Studies have shown that vehicular accidents involving deer increased by 16% during the week following the fall time shift. And if you're like most Americans, you spent a little time at the water cooler today bemoaning the fact that we still change our clocks. Didn't Congress pass a law putting us on permanent daylight saving? While the Senate passed the Sunshine Protection Act of 2022, it died in House committee shortly thereafter. But what would permanent daylight saving look like? Fewer days waking up after the sun, and more days with more sunlight after work and school. That's worth pointing out that we already spend about 2/3 of the year observing daylight saving, so on the whole, the change isn't that drastic. And it's also worth pointing out that whether we permanently observe daylight saving, standard time, stick with the current shifts in the spring and the fall, or something in between, the amount of daylight on any given day is going to stay the same. It's just how we align it to the clocks. Now, the numbers vary by your location, particularly how far east or west you are within a time zone, and the impact is most felt in the morning. But for comparison, assuming someone who gets up around 7 a.m. and is happiest when the sun is still above the horizon at 7 p.m., I looked at Atlanta. Shifting the clocks there an hour and staying there would provide about 6.5 more weeks of sunsets after 7 p.m. and just 5 more days of waking up before the sun. But if you look a little bit to the west, in Birmingham, Alabama, its position near the eastern edge of the central time zone has a pretty big impact. Sure, the additional 115 days of sunsets after 7 p.m. would be great, but instead of only having a few post 7 a.m. sunsets, that would shift to several months. And it's those dark mornings at the school bus stop that are often brought up by parents as a concern. But think of this. The school year is generally centered on the time of year when the sunrise is the latest, that first week or two of January. Also consider that winter break takes a couple of those weeks of the darkest mornings out of the picture. Again, that impact is highly dependent on longitude. Consider Houston, smack dab in the middle of the central time zone. The astronauts kids, they're going to be catching that 7 a.m. bus before the sun peaks over the horizon, exactly 0 more days under permanent daylight saving. The same's true out at the time zone's western edge, somewhere like Midland, Texas. Here in Raleigh, North Carolina, near the middle of the eastern time zone, the bus would beat the sun a few more weeks of the year under permanent daylight saving. And I don't even want to consider staying on standard time. We'd lose about half of our post 7 p.m. sunsets that way. That's your astronomy outlook. Follow me at RTP Hokie for more spacey stuff like this.
If you enjoy WeatherBrains, there's a global community of thousands of weather enthusiasts you'll want to join. The American Meteorological Society's Weather Band at amsweatherband.org. Connect with weather enthusiasts all over the world, as well as 10,000 plus members of the AMS. You can swap questions, data, and stories with researchers, broadcasters, storm chasers, and more. Join interactive weather webinars, test your trivia knowledge, enter your photos in the WeatherBand photo contest, or attend the annual Jamposium. WeatherBand is a place to nurture and share your love of weather. Get full membership for just $12 per year by going to amsweatherband.org.
When the weather ball is red, warmer weather is ahead. When the weather ball is white, colder weather is in sight. When the weather ball is green, no change in the weather is foreseen. When colors blink, by night or day, precipitation's on the way.
All right, so we're doing the show here on the 6th of November. So, Brian Norcross, can we stick a fork in the hurricane season? Are we done, or is there more to come?
Well, we're done for the U.S. There's a slight chance, I think, if something could spin up either in the Southern Caribbean or sometimes in the Atlantic, a non-tropical system sits out over the still warm water near Bermuda somewhere. But for the U.S., yeah, I think it's done.
There you go. You heard it on this show first. It's done for the United States. So let's go up to our Arctic correspondent, Jen. So when's the next cold shot coming, Jen?
It's coming end of the week, for me, and it'll kind of spill southward from there. But we've been fairly mild. It was a little windy today, so there's a nip in the air, but we're seeing highs in the 60s up this way. But then we'll see highs in the 40s by Friday. It should be dry for the upcoming weekend here, so that's good news.
Okie doke. So let's go down to the other extreme, and Troy Kimmel, who is deep in the heart of Texas. Troy, how you doing with your heat levels there?
Well, it hadn't been all that bad, James, lately. I mean, we've seen a little break in it and everything, but we got into the weekend and now we're back into a south wind, and we've seen temperatures getting back above 80. I think midweek for Austin, we may be flirting with some record highs. We'll wait and see across central Texas. By the end of the week, another shot of cooler air coming in from the north, and then kind of an overrunning pattern. Pacific storm system making its way across, and I think mainly closer to the Gulf Coast. Maybe not so much Austin. Some rain for the end of the week on into the weekend. But I'm encouraged by what I'm seeing on the 8 to 14 day outlooks from our colleagues at the Climate Prediction Center, which show much of the western U.S. with above average precipitation. So we'll see how that all works out in the long run, James.
All right, let's go to our Oklahoma correspondent, Rick Smith. What's happening in Norman, Oklahoma?
Well, James A. mentioned it earlier. It's a beautiful day today. It was up in the lower 80s. We're expecting more 80s the next 2 days, kind of flirting with some record highs. I think Wichita Falls broke a record high for today, if I'm not mistaken, and that could happen again the next 2 days. And a little precip coming in and then back down to more seasonal temperatures. So kind of typical, what season is it time of year?
James A. Lot, what say you in Tulsa?
The weather ball is red here too. We're going to be warming up a little bit tomorrow and Wednesday again, probably within 2 degrees of a record high on Wednesday. I think we're going 85 and the record's 86. Same thing here. It'll be back to seasonable levels as we go back, hopefully, to November instead of September and November. It's been an interesting year, and yeah, Rick, I think you're right. How many record highs has Wichita Falls broken this year? Gosh.
And down here in the Deep South, had a pretty nasty flash drought. We've had really, really, really dry conditions for the past couple of months, but we're starting to see some good signals from the global models that we're going to kind of see a pattern flip and evidence of maybe some heavy type rain events over the latter half of the month, and maybe even some severe weather type events. We haven't had that here in a long time, but we are in our hurricane. See, we get Brian on the show, and I'm thinking hurricanes now. We're in the tornado season here where we are now through May. So let's kind of shift over to picks of the week. This is where we go around the horn, and Brian, we're going to give you a couple of minutes to think about it, but everybody's going to share something that is weather related that we'll post up on WeatherBrains.com. So Rick Smith, let's just start with you. Give us a good pick.
Well, there were some incredible Northern Lights pictures from last night, I believe it was, one from Glasgow, Montana, the National Weather Service office there with the radar in the foreground. I think one of the forecasters up there took that picture last night. Just incredible colors, and I would love to be able to see that someday. Didn't quite get down this far, but that's my pick.
Awesome. And again, all the links will be up on the website, weatherbrains.com. And we should mention that Bill Murray did have to break away to get on a call with some of the folks on this weather podcast telethon that they're working on, and we'll have more about that next week. All right, Jen, give us a good pick of the week. All
righty. Big thank you to WeatherBrains listener Richard Cook. That's where I'm getting my pick of the week. He is across the pond in the UK, and it's been very active there. 3 named low pressure systems already: Agnes, Babette, and hopefully I'm going to say this right. I've heard it mentioned in a couple of different ways, but Storm Kieran. And that storm had a big impact on the Channel Islands, over 100-mile-per-hour winds, and also a tornado. And the latest coming in from Toro on that, in conjunction with the Jersey Met Service, of a T6 on the tornado International Tornado Intensity Scale. And I was looking that up a little bit because I'm not familiar with that. That is a moderately devastating tornado, 161 to 186 mile per hour winds. And so there's an article that Richard sent our way that the Jersey tornado believed to be the most powerful recorded in British Isles for nearly 70 years. Has some damage photos, very significant here damage. and wanted to pass that on. It'd be great to have some folks from Toro on the show to learn more about what happens there and the scale and what have you. So we'll see if Bill can get on that.
Good deal. All right. And my pick, a professor at Jacksonville State University, which is a college in the eastern part of Alabama, and they have an emergency management program there, which is really good. And one of the professors has been awarded a $237,000 grant through NOAA to study emergency communications and preparedness among the deaf and hard of hearing. And we often talk about not communicating well with certain people groups, and I think that's certainly one good example. So looking forward to seeing how the research goes with that and what information we can gather from that. So again, that'll be my pick of the week. Troy Kimmel, let's go down to you. What you got?
Don't have a link to go with this, but the International Association of Emergency Managers meeting on the West Coast, I believe, right now. And my understanding, and I'm seeing some evidence of this, but I have nothing to share with you. But I know Ken Graham, I believe, is out there and addressed that group. Some discussion of something called weather.gov 2.0. And this would be a redo, if you will, of the website, which is good news for me. I'm hoping that that's something that headquarters is going to really push. I can only imagine what a pain in the rear end it would be, because that is the website itself is just so involved, and they've tried to do some changes here and there, and it's been more patchwork, but it makes me feel good that Weather Service is addressing this. Ken is apparently talking about it. Weather.gov 2.0, something you may want to watch for here in over the next couple of weeks, see that discussion come up.
Any comments from you, Rick, on that, Rick?
No, it's happening. I think every Weather Service office has been asked to nominate 5 partners who will be involved as a focus group. I don't know what it's officially called, but to evaluate this. It started in Nashville, I think, the first prototype, and I don't know much about it at all, but it's exciting. And if they can make the climate information easier to find on the website, it'll be a success, because good Lord, it's hard for us to even find it sometimes. So
preach on, brother. All right.
Yeah.
James Adelot, he's getting set for a 9 o'clock newscast. What you got for us?
Well, mine is Alex Spahn finally has done a time lapse of that enormously photogenic supercell in September that moved close to Ada, Oklahoma. And it is a tremendous time lapse. And honorable mention, California is out of drought conditions for the first time in 3 years, too. So that is an honorable mention from me.
Good for them. All right, Brian, we've given you some time to think about it. Give us something fun that's weather related. Go.
Well, I saw posted in the last week or so in this discussion about Otis, actually, and how strong the storm was at landfall, and comparing the royal palm trees. So royal palms are the kind of palm trees that have a smooth trunk on them, and pictures of the royal palms in Acapulco. And the comparison was to a famous photograph that was taken after Hurricane Andrew. And it was actually a week after Hurricane Andrew in Homestead, with the Homestead water tower there and a lightning bolt hitting the water tower. Because after Hurricane Andrew, when so many people lost their roofs and were living in like one bedroom of their house, there were torrential rains later that week and lightning storms and so forth. And so it's a very, very poignant picture of this torrential downpour, with the royal palm trees after Hurricane Andrew look just like the ones in the picture from Acapulco. So just sort of bringing, Hurricane Andrew to the present time and what those people went through in Acapulco, Mexico.
Excellent. Anything else we need to plug, Brian, on your end? Any social media accounts? Anything at all? This is your plug-a-rama. Go.
Well, I'm on Twitter at @bnorcross, on post on Facebook every morning if there's anything going on. It's facebook.com/Brian Norcross Weather, and also on foxweather.com. Post all the time. Lots and lots of weather coverage there as well. So I'll see you there.
Awesome. And again, you are one of the greats, and thanks for your time tonight, and thanks for all you've done for the Weather Enterprise. And again, Bill Murray had to jump off. Typically, he'd be plugging the shows in coming weeks here, but it's been a really good show tonight. And if you're new here, WeatherBrains is typically on the air every Monday night at 8 o'clock Eastern, 7 o'clock Central. And you can watch it live. We stream on the WeatherBrains YouTube channel, youtube.com/WeatherBrains. But most of you listen to the audio podcast. However you consume this, thank you. And if you want to get in touch with us, the email address, it is email@weatherbrains.com. So on behalf of the entire WeatherBrains crew, I'm James Spann. Thanks a lot for listening. Have a great week and God bless. Thanks, Brian. Great show. Thank you.
Fantastic.
Thank
Really
you, Brian.
good stuff.
Awesome.
Great stuff.
Awesome.
All right. Thanks,
Thanks,
guys.
You bet.
Thanks,